This guy asked me in the chat if I can make a video of resources in Angular with NgRX Signal Store. And as a good developer, when I started looking into it, I actually found myself working on 10 different other things that included upgrading my whole Angular cookbook repositories with 150 plus project to Angular v19. Yay!
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
And as a result, this video presents you how to use Angular's resource API with NgRX Signal Store, which I think is one of the best ways to manage state within your Angular applications today. Let's get started. This is the application that we are looking at today using NgRX Signal Store with resource API, which is new in Angular. So what we are going to do is we are going to implement a searching feature within the existing application. And if you have not watched my previous video on how to use signals within Angular, you can watch it right here. Right now what happens is that I'm loading the information or the to-dos from an API, and then we show them here, and then we are able to just toggle them as well. For example, you can click this. You can also try to add my new to do, and then it gets added right here. And all of that is being done with a placeholder API or a fake API called JSON placeholder. So if I refresh now, you can see that we make this API call, which essentially gets us a bunch of to-dos just like this. And those are the ones that we are showing right here. And if you try to add something, for example, add this, you see we make one more API call. And then since it's a fake API, it still returns the results as success, as you can see right here, and then we add that on the top. So we are going to replace all of this with resource. Now, one of the things that is important when working with resource is that you need to understand that resource is supposed to be used only for read operations, not for writing, not for toggling, or not for even adding new items. So which means that we are going to only have one resource for to-dos, and we are going to manipulate it within the code. And you can see that in the documentation as well. So this is async reactivity with resources, and just the mindset of this approach of using signals and reactivity here is important. For example, in my particular case, if I'm trying to add a new to-do, am I reacting to a signal? Not really. I'm just trying to add new item, and in result, I will update a signal. So reactivity with resource means that whenever there's a change in a particular signal, then the resource will be refetched. In this particular case, it makes much more sense to use the resource within search, because if the search query changes and then we reload the resource, that's where this reactivity really comes into play and makes much more sense. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. So we are going to use one resource. We are going to do a couple of things. First of all, we'll have the resource that will allow us to show a loader, an error, but also we'll be able to use things like an abort signal to abort previous requests. For example, if I'm trying to search something and I start typing, for example, DEL, ideally what should happen is that only the last character, which is L, should make the call. And if that's not the case, that means I'm sending a call on D, E, L, all of them. So in this particular case, the previous calls should be cancelled. So only one call returns the data and gets used. But this is just theoretical. So now let's get into the code. So first of all, we are going to be working within the Angular Cookbook Second Edition's code repository, and you should find the link in the description of this video. Once you have done that, I want you to check out this particular branch, which is Signal Store resource, to do a git checkout this. Once you have done that, make sure to run npm install from the root project or from the root of this workspace. This will make sure that you have all the dependencies installed. This will take some time. Once you have done that, just run npm run serve, and then you can do ngCC signals. This will start the signals application in its start state where we are going to continue from. And once you run that, you should be able to see the same application that we have right here. This is not using resource at the moment at all. Now, the very first thing that I want you to do once you have served this is go to start. So from the top of the project, you can go to start, then apps, and chapter 1, and then ngCC signals. This is the project that we are working with. And inside that, go to source app, and inside the store, you should see this todos.store.ts. This is the file that we are going to work on, and app component HTML and app component TS. But the major work would be here. So if we have a look at the application so far, we essentially have a store using the NgRX Signal Store. As you can see right here, the contract of the store looks like this. So we have an array of to-dos. We have a filter, and we have initialized set to true or false. If you go to the application, you can see that we are showing the list of to-dos right here. We have a filter at the bottom that says show the active ones or the completed ones or all of them. And the third thing that we saw was initialize, which is just used at the bottom to make sure that we save our to-dos in the local storage after the store has been initialized or after we have gotten our first response from the API. Now, as I said, that the resource is supposed to be used for reading the data. In that particular scenario, this is where we read the data the first time for our application. Since we are using with hooks and on init, which means that as soon as the store is initiated, we send an API call to get the to-dos, and that's how we show the to-dos on the view. If I comment this out and go to my application, you will see that now we don't show any to-dos at all, even though we have them in the storage. So if I go to inspect, I go to application, and look at here, local storage, you can see that we do have ng cookbook to-dos here, but we don't really show them because we removed the code. Instead of doing it here, we need to use the resource. So for the resource, we should not really have a resource in our store or in our state. We would rather have that as a prop. So in here, before with commuted, I'm going to use something called withProps, which is part of the Signal Store. And withProps can have multiple props within it. And the prop we are going to have is the to-dos store. So this has almost the same signature as with computed or with method. So here I actually have the access to my store, and I can also have access to other services. For example, I could use the HTTP client here using inject, and I can use the HTTP client right here. Now from within here, I need to return a set of properties, which will be my props. So the first property that I'm going to return from here is going to be called todos resource. So I'm going to say underscore todos resource. And the reason I'm having this as underscore is because I don't want to use this in my components. I don't want to expose this outside of the Signal Store. I'm going to be using this inside the Signal Store. So this is going to be a resource, and the resource is going to be imported from Angular core. Now, since I'm using HTTP client with observables, I could use resource or I could use rxResource. So for now, I'm going to show you with rxResource, and this is going to be a colon here. So rxResource is going to be my choice here. And this has to be imported from a different path than Angular core. So you need to do something like this. You're going to use Angular core rxjs interop, and from this one, you're going to use rxResource just like this. So we need to define what kind of resource is this, or what is the type of the data that this is going to have. So this is going to have a to-do items array, and we are going to use a source for this. So whenever the search term changes within our application, we are going to re-trigger this resource so it gets data from the API. And that search term is going to be of type string. Now we can define the source and also the loader function. So here I'm going to call request. This takes an argument of the signal. Whenever that signal changes, we are going to request, or we are going to make the HTTP call. In this particular case, we need the search term. So whenever the user tries to search something, that should be changed. That means we should have it somewhere, which means that we are going to store that in the state. So here I'm going to call it search term. It's going to be of type string, and I'm going to initialize it with empty string just like this. Now I can go here and say store.search term. Now this search term is essentially a signal. If you mouse over store, you can see that the search term here is a signal of type string, which means that this request would trigger the loader function whenever this term changes. So I'm going to now define the loader here, and the loader is a function that accepts params and should return back an observable. And this is going to be my observable, which is actually the same as what we have at the bottom right here, where we had this particular code. So I'm going to also import the rxjs map here, and I'm going to change this search term, or I'm going to create a variable for this. So here I can say const, and here I can say equals param. So we are going to extract two things from here. The first thing would be request. So in request, we actually get this exact thing, or the value of the signal. So the type of request is actually going to be string, since we are looking at search term here. We're going to alias it to search term just for more readability. And another thing that we get from params is the abort signal to abort the request, as I mentioned earlier. So in this particular case, I'm using the search term now to actually filter out the title or the or the to-dos based on their titles. So what we are going to do here is that whenever the user searches something, we are still going to make the exact same call, which means we are bringing all the to-dos, but we are using this pipe and map to actually go into the to-dos array and filter only the to-dos which match the title of what we are searching essentially. And if anything goes wrong, we are going to roll back to getting the information from storage or local storage, so we can return it back just like this. Now that we have done this, if we go back to the application, nothing would work. So if I refresh now, you can see there's a call that went to to-dos, and that is because the resource, as soon as it is initialized, it goes to the API call out of the box. So it will make the call with the search term being empty string, and you need to understand that, or you need to be careful of that, which means that if I actually remove this whole to-do resource or comment this out, now you will see that when the application refreshes, we won't have the to-dos call at all, which basically shows that the resource is making the call. I'm going to enable this again, and let's talk about what happens or how do we really use this in the UI. Now, our UI already uses something called .todos or the to-dos array that we have. So here you can see we are using store.todos.length to actually show at the top. We are also using something called filtered to-dos to show the list of the items, which we see when there are items right here. Now, if we go to the filtered to-dos, you will notice that the filtered to-dos are dependent on the to-dos array. Now, since we are using a resource, we should not be using the to-dos a signal or a separate to-dos property here. Since we have the resource, we should be directly using that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually comment this one out so the to-dos doesn't exist anymore. But if I do that, you can see that I have all these red things right here. So everything is basically dependent on to-dos. So what I would do rather is I would create a computed property called to-dos that reflects the resource. So I'm going to go here and say to-dos, and here I'm going to do computed, which will be a function right here. I'm going to put a comma here. And here I'm going to also import something called to-dos resource. So here I can import this. I'll remove this to-dos from here because we are not using this anymore. And in the computed, I'm going to go and say, I want to say to-dos resource dot value. And that's pretty much it. And now that I have this, instead of using this to-dos filter, I'm actually going to use the to-do resource value. I cannot use the store.todos or this computed property within the with computed, unfortunately, because this is being declared at the same time. So what's gonna happen here is I'm going to actually go here and I'm going to replace this with to-do resource dot value, just like this. But now one thing that you have to understand is that the value of resource by default when it initiates is undefined. And no matter what you do, it's going to be undefined until you get some value from the HTTP request. That's why we also need to make sure that we are using a question mark in the completed to-dos. I hate to use this, to be honest, being a JavaScript/TypeScript developer, but it is what it is. So I'm going to quickly go here and say, I'm going to use the double pipes, and here I'm going to say, otherwise just return an empty array. And you're going to see me using this quite often. If you have a better approach, just let me know in the comments and I'll try to upgrade myself with that. Similarly, when we are using this right here, we're going to use the same thing. So we are going to use to-do resource dot value, and we are also going to make sure that we are using this question mark right here, and we can also use this as well. Another thing that you could also do is something like this. So you could say to-do resource dot has value. If you do this, then you would be either returning this or you're going to be returning this. That could also work if you want to use that, to be honest. But in this case, also, you're going to be using this question mark because of the type narrowing TypeScript issue that everybody knows so far. So again, you're going to use either this or that. I'm going to just go with this approach, to be honest, everywhere. So here also, I'm going to just use to-do resource dot value. And I'm going to be using this here as well. And in here also, I'm just going to be using the same thing and this. So now our filtered to-dos are actually good to go. Now, if I go down here, you can also see that we have this add to-do, which is trying to patch state. We're going to fix that in just a bit. And then we also have this new completed or toggle to do, which is also trying to do the same thing. So instead of using store.todos here, we're going to be using the same thing. So to-do resource.value, and we're going to ensure that the value is there so it can find it. And then we would have the new completed. And I'm also going to comment out the patch state for now for you. Finally, in the on init, you can see that when we do state.initialized, we are actually saving the information from state.todos. This should not be like this. Rather than using it like this, you could actually go and say store.todos, just like this, and that would also work. And now that we have done all these changes, if we look at terminal, you see that we still have some errors here. For example, we have this.store.todos, which could be there, could not be there, and that's why it's crying. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go to our todos computed, which is right here. So we are going to actually have either todos resource.value, or we are going to return the empty array from here as well. And that should make things pass. As you can see, compile successfully. Now, if I go to my application and refresh, you can see that we do show the information right here. So we do have the to-dos being shown right here. If I clear this, refresh it once again, you can see we only make one to-dos call, which brings us data, and then we show it. Now, if I try to go to my application, you can see we have cookbook to-dos here. If I clear this and refresh this again, you can see that now we don't really save them in our local storage, which is a regression, which is something that was working and now not working. How do we fix that? And what happens if the call fails? The reason why it's not really working is if you go down to where this actually stores in the local storage is if the state is initialized. In the previous code, when we made the HTTP call, we actually did a patch state to make sure that the initialize is true. Now we don't really do that anymore with the resource. So if I go here, you can see we have this to-do resource, which actually doesn't do any patch state, etc. Now there could be two ways of solving this. One, you make this change somewhere else, maybe from a component. I would actually be very blunt and go and do it right inside the pipe here once we have gotten the response. So I'm going to do it here. So I'm going to actually comment or uncomment this out here. I'm going to remove the to-dos from here, and I'll just make it initialized true, even if it calls it multiple times. That's fine. Now, if I go here and try to go to the application, you'll see that it is already saved, and you'll also see these logs as well. So this first log of the effect is done when we initialize the store, and this one actually happens after we have received the call or HTTP calls result, and the initialize is set from false to true. Here you can see it was false, here it is set to true. So now if I refresh, it actually goes inside my applications data, which means in local storage. So even if I clean it, you can see that now it's being saved. Great. So that's done now. Now the next step would be, can we actually implement and are we triggering the resource again if the search term changes? Now we don't have anything for search term at all, but let's implement it. So for this, I'm going to actually go to my app component TS and just making sure that we have the forms module here, which is here. I'm going to create a new signal here called search term, and we are going to call it signal of empty string. And then I'm going to actually go to our app component HTML. Just before this form, I'm going to add another input. And here it is. We have the name for this called search to-dos. It is going to bind itself directly to the search term, which is defined right here, which we just defined. And this is a signal as well. And then you can see we have some just classes here. If you go to the UI, it looks something like this. So now I should be able to just type something and that updates the signal. But how do we trigger the resource to do another call? Right now, it doesn't do anything because nothing is bound to the resource. If you remember, our resource is actually bound to the stores search term variable, which is actually this one. Now, in order for this resource to trigger again, we need to somehow update this search term. That's what we want to do. So what we are going to do is we are going to go inside the with methods and we are going to add another method. We are going to call this update search term. And this is going to just take the new value of the search term. So what this is going to do is to have a search term. This is going to be of type string. And then as soon as this comes in, we are going to do a patch state. We're going to take the existing store. And here I can say search term is going to be search term, right? We can write it just like this. Now, if we save this, we have a way of using this method inside our app component. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually go and add this line here, which is ng model change. And we are going to directly call the stores update search method, or what we have called it here. So if I go to here, it's update search term. So we are going to use the update search term right here, and we are going to pass the value from the input directly. Now, if we try to go here in the code, and if I try to type something, for example, del, you can see that we actually sent 3 calls. So wherever something changes, our resource is triggered, it comes back with the response. And then if there's a search term, it is actually filtered out. You can actually see that within the sources as well. So for example, if you scroll all the way up here and you put a breakpoint right here, you will see that if I remove this L here, we are now going to make a HTTP call. It comes back with all the to-dos, which is an array of 20 different to-dos. And then for each particular to-do, it goes inside and then it looks at the to-dos title. For example, the first one is this one, and then it includes the search term to lowercase. So it's going to filter it out, and then whatever matches, it's going to send that back, which means we will see just filtered to-dos. Great. However, the problem that I have with this particular approach is that it sends multiple calls, and that's not okay. So if I try to, for example, remove everything, it's going to send one call. And now if I try something like QUIS, you can see 4 different calls that were sent. We don't want to do that. We want to abort the previous calls. Now with rxResource, you don't even need to use the abort signal because Angular by default cancels the previous request. For example, if I go here and do no throttling, and if I try all these calls, you can see all of them were fulfilled, but that's just because my internet is super nice. If I remove this and throttle it to slow 4G, let's see what happens now. So if I do QUIS, you can see that automatically this cancels the previous request and only the last one is being fulfilled. Awesome. However, if you used the resource function, which uses a promise-based API, you could actually use the abort signal with fetch directly. And let me show you how to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go ahead and comment all of this out. And we're going to change this rxResource to just resource, which uses the promise-based API. And from here, I can actually this code that I'm going to show you just now. We're going to make this function async. Now, what we're doing is we are using the async await. We are using the resource right here. We are using a try catch mechanism, and we are using fetch first. And here in the options, we are passing an abort signal as signal. This is where you want to use fetch and pass it like this. Then we are looking at the response.status, and then we are also throwing an error as well, or just logging it. And we're also falling back into if there's an issue with the API call, we just use the array or the to-dos from storage. So it's actually the same as the rxResource or what we were doing before. Now, if I go here, you'll see that things work as they were before. So if I reload this and if I try to slow 4G, here you can see that if I do QUIS, these are being canceled as well. Now, if I remove this, let's see what happens. I'm going to do no throttling. Clear this, now go to slow 4G and do QUIS, and you can see that all of the calls are being fulfilled. So if you're using the fetch based API, you need to pass the abort signal. rxResource handles it by default, or actually the Angular code makes it the right way. Now I'm going to keep the fetch API here just so you can also try it out later as well. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to look into 2 different things. One, how do we make the other APIs or the other features compatible with what we have right now? For example, adding a new to-do or toggling a to-do. For example, if I try to toggle a to-do, you see that we do make an API call, but this is not toggled at all. Similarly, if I try to add a new task, a new task, then I can also add it, but you will see that nothing actually shows up here. However, the API calls are being done as they were before. The first thing we are going to look at now is the add to-do feature to update it. So instead of writing the patch state to to-dos, we can actually do it directly to the rxResource or the resource that we have created. So here we could do store.todoResource.update, and in the update we get the to-dos. Now these to-dos are either the array that we have or we have undefined. So what we can do here is that we can say if we don't have to-dos, which means that it's undefined, then we just return an array, and the array would have the new to-do that we have just gotten, right? Similarly, if that's not the case, then we just return the to-do and the existing to-dos, just like this. So let's try this out in the app. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say this is a new to-do. So here we can say new task. And if I hit add here, you can see that we can see the new task right here after the API call has finished. Awesome. Now we can remove this particular code from here, and then we can go to the toggle to-do. So in here, we were already checking the new completed property with the right to-do's resource value. Now what I can do is that instead of this patch state, we can do the same thing in the actual resource. So I'm going to actually uncomment it so I can copy the values. So here, I'm just going to copy it. And then I can go here and say store.todoResource.update. And in this case, we just want to update this value. And here we are going to actually return store.todos.map, or actually you can take the to-dos from here directly. So here, let's say to-dos and not the parentheses at all. So todos.map, and this should be available. So here we're going to ensure that this has a value, or you could use a question mark here. So that means that we are going to update the resource when we are toggling correctly. Now, instead of using the question mark here, what I would like to do again here is if there are not to-dos, so I just return an empty array. So I don't have to do this hacky magic here. And And there we go. Now we can try it on the app. So now if I go here and if I try to mark this as done, you can see that this toggles it right after the API call. So if I click this, you can see that this is toggled. This is untoggled, this is untoggled. So this is working as expected. Great, so everything is working as expected. Even if I go and try to get all the active ones, you can see the filter works as well. This works as well. So everything is working as it should in with the search, as you can see right here. Now, one of the things with resource is that you also get the ability to see if the resource is loading or if there's an error, but we are not using that feature so far at all. We should be using that because right now, if I make it, let's say slow 4G, it tries to get the data, but the user would have no idea that the data is being loaded at the moment. So we should probably show something like loading or something when there's an API call there. And if something goes wrong, we should be also able to show that as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to first remove the code that we are not really using and this one as well. And now we are going to create two computed properties for loading and error. So here what I can do is I can say Todos loading, and this is going to be a computed. And what I'm going to do here is just returning Todos resource dot is loading, which essentially is a signal. And similarly, I can create another thing which is going to be Todos loading error. And this is going to be the Todos resource dot error, which essentially is set when there's an error with the API call. Now that I have both of these, I can actually update that in the component. So I can go to app component HTML, and here just before the tasks list, I can actually add an if block, and I can say if we have store dot loading or Todos loading, then I'm going to just add a spinner here or a loader here. And to keep it simple, I'm just going to say loading dot dot dot, which is more than enough for now. You can maybe enhance it a bit more. And similarly, I'm going to say if there is an error, so else if there's an error, so store dot Todos loading error. If that's the case, then I just want to render that as well. So I'm going to say store dot is loading or Todos loading error. Let's save this and try this out. What's happening here? So else if it's trying to, or I think the linting or the autosave is trying to mess up the code. So I'm going to go here and say save without formatting. And now if I go here, we can actually see the loading as well. So here you saw briefly there was a loading message here. We can try this again. So let's make it a slow 4G. And here if I do QIS, you can see here, if I remove this, you can see that as well. There we go. So you can see all of those as well. Now what happens when there's an error? So for that, we can actually go and simulate an error. For example, let's go to our loader function, and in here we can actually throw an error by just changing the URL. So if I save this now, go here, let's see what happens. So I'm gonna do no throttling, and here you can see that it works still, no error shown even if we are throwing an error. And that is because we have made a conscious choice, I hope, that we are actually using as a fallback. So we are using the Todos from storage if something goes with this particular API call. You could say that no, not going to do that. We're actually going to throw the error as it is. If we do that, then you actually see the error right in the UI because you're throwing that error in the code or in the catch block. So choose whatever you want to do. You can also throw a custom error if you wanted. Let's say the API call was just fine, but you decided that no, if 1 equals 1, then I'm going to just say throw new error, what is love? And there you go, error, what is love? What is it? And now that we have looked at the error as well, I think we're done. We have pretty nice code. Just make sure to clean the dependencies which are not being used. But if you look at the code in itself, they're actually not using the HTTP client in here. So I'm going to remove this as well. So we are using fetch right here. We have a single Todos resource, which actually is being used throughout the store. So here we have all the computed working with the Todos resource. We have all the methods also using the same thing. So whenever there's a change, we actually update our resource directly, and we didn't even need to create variable in the state for that. So the resource is doing all of the things for us. One of the things that you should probably keep in mind is the resource is a really good way to work with signals, which will bring this asynchronous reactivity into a synchronous workflow within your app. And the practical benefit, apart from the technical sort of side of things, is that you don't have to create all these variables in your state yourself. So the idea is I don't have to maintain the loading or set it to false and then true and then set the error to false or true. If I'm using a resource, if there's an error, the error signal automatically is filled with that, which is right here. If the loading gets to true or false, defaults, that's also handled right here. So the resource is just a really good API to use whenever you have your read operations, especially if they're around something that changes constantly. In our case, that was the search term. So just adding the search feature allowed us to do all of these things. And that's pretty much it. I hope you learned quite a lot of things from this video. And if you want to dive more into Angular, check out the Angular cookbook. You should be able to see the link right here. And there's also another book that I'm working on right now, surprise for you. It is going to be Mastering Angular Signals. So we are going to dive more into signals, what they are, what are the practical use cases, and how to effectively use all of these things like computed, effects, link signals, resources, and even APIs like input, model, and view child that are available as signals for us. So let me know what you're excited about, and let me know if there are any cool projects that you're working on in the comments. As always, happy coding. I'm going to see you next time.